And now I'm going to introduce our moderator for today's event, Doug Shadell, AARP Washington State Director. Take it away, Doug.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. As Amanda said, my name is Doug Shadell, and I'm the State Director for AARP Washington. And on behalf of AARP and BECU and the Center for an Informed Public, we are absolutely thrilled to be presenting this third in a series of 4 talks on sorting fact from fiction. Tonight's topic, the future of lying. And we have had an incredible response to this. We've had over 5,000 people pre-register for at least one of these events this fall. And it just obviously has struck a chord, this topic of how to spot misinformation and lying, especially on the internet. And I'll be introducing Dr. Jeff Hancock from Stanford in just a second. But I want to just take 1 minute to talk about kind of why AARP is involved in this. We have spent many years at AARP Washington going across the state doing consumer education talks. Some of you may have actually attended some of them, talking about everything from retirement planning to cyber safety to fraud prevention and so forth. But this has been an unusual year. We've really had to pivot. Our commitment to consumer ed hasn't changed, but what we talk about and how we talk about it has changed because of the COVID pandemic. In March, like many other organizations, we shut down all of our in-person events, which is sort of the lifeblood of what we do here, gathering people together, and instead started doing teletown halls, using platforms like this, Intrado, which is a new system, to try and reach people with information about the COVID virus. And we interviewed mayors, had local public health officials on. But this fall, we decided to pivot to something we think is equally a problem, and it's not a pandemic as much as an infodemic. And that is just the proliferation of misinformation, disinformation, and out lies that are going on all over our social media platforms. And that's just one of the reasons why I'm so thrilled to have Dr. Hancock here, because this is what he does. This is his expertise. Dr. Hancock is the founding director of the Stanford Social Media Lab and a professor in the Department of Communications at Stanford. Professor Hancock and his group work on understanding psychological and interpersonal processes, especially in social media. He is a well-known researcher on how people use deception with technology, from sending texts and emails to detecting fake online reviews. He had his TED Talk, and I would recommend it, although you're here today, so you don't need to listen to his TED Talk, but his TED Talk has been seen by over 1 million people, and he's been on all the networks. I first saw Dr. Hancock when we sponsored a one-day university a couple of years ago, and myself and my colleagues were just kind of blown away by his insights. So I'm really thrilled that you all are here. I'm really thrilled that Dr. Hancock's here. Before I have him come on, I just want to mention one more logistical thing that Amanda alluded to. Dr. Hancock's going to talk for about 40 minutes. He's got a bunch of slides. They're fascinating. I was looking at them last night. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. So I encourage any of you who, during the course of the talk, if it generates a question, put the question in the question and answer box there on your screen, because I will then come back on after 40 minutes and facilitate a Q&A session where we'll try and cover as many of those as possible. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Hancock from Stanford University. Jeff?
Thanks so much, Doug. I appreciate the introduction, and greetings to everybody up in Seattle. Greetings from California. I'm in Palo Alto today in my home, which one of the things I love about the video world we're living in right now is we get to see into all our homes. So here's part of my home, and welcome. I'm looking forward to spending a few minutes with you today talking about deception and technology. It's such a huge topic right now, and one that brings a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. And as a psychologist that's studied this for a long time, I want to give you some concrete ideas and techniques to help arm you as you use the internet to accomplish things you're going to do day to day. And I think we're going to try and work on the things that we need to really worry about and the things that maybe you need to be a little bit less worried about. At the end, I have some recommendations of a book that I think is fantastic, and a course that MediaWise is putting on that's for seniors and to improve their sort of resilience with dealing with misinformation, and I highly recommend that as well. So we're going to dive right into the future of lying and what I think is maybe one of the most fascinating topics that we as a society are dealing with right now. And when we think about lies and technology, there's lots of ways that we can think about it. And before we get into the scary ones, we can think about some of the funny ones. So here's one on a platform called Snapchat. It's very visual oriented. The photos tend to disappear after a little while. And this says, probably the best Snapchat I've ever sent. And it shows somebody with their knees up in front of the pool on vacation. And what we find, in fact, is that it's not really their knees. In fact, they've got their knuckles in front of a laptop, and they've taken a picture of that. And so we can see when technology is involved, there's lots of possibilities for deception. In this case, a kind of funny one. But technology is such a huge factor in most facets of our lives that wherever human society goes and human processes go, deception follows. So we can see, on online reviews, which people rely on all the time. Just today, I was buying some things on Amazon. And of course, one of the first things I look at are the reviews that my fellow consumers are doing. And unfortunately, there's big concerns about deception there. We rely on them. They tend to be very useful, but there's known cases of fake reviews. This is a big problem for consumers given how much online business takes place. We can also see it when we think about our democracy and how to understand who is saying what, and even beyond who, but also what. Is that person that's saying something online actually a person that's concerned about a topic or believing X, Y, or Z? Or is that a bot, a piece of software that's imitating a human and trying to get us to believe that what they are saying is something that somebody actually believes? And as we move into the era of AI, more and more of these technologies can replicate what humans sound like. And we move into an era when we're on technology, it's not clear whether the person we're talking to is in fact a person. And it's easy with the current environment of all these concerns to be worried about deception, and that perhaps deception is worse than it's ever been, that we're in a trust crisis, and that we are lying to each other more than we ever have. Some good news there is that we as humans have been worried about this for a long, long time. So some of you that remember your classical training back in college, or perhaps have been taking one-day university courses and learning about the classics, you'll recognize who this is. This is Diogenes, Greek philosopher. And you'll also probably remember what his lantern was and why he was, what he was looking for. He was looking for a single honest man. And of course, the story goes that he died without ever finding one. Very uplifting story. But it symbolizes this concern that we in 2020, October, are feeling right now, that lying is worse than it's ever been, that the current generation has more deception, that we can't trust each other as much. Diogenes felt exactly the same way. He felt that there was a lack of honesty, a lack of honor. And it wasn't just Diogenes in the West. Around the same time, Confucius in China was making the same kind of arguments. Confucianism has a real focus on authenticity, of not only talking the talk, but walking the walk. So this concern with current status of deception, if there's more than there's ever been, is actually a very, very old human concern. And for a good reason. Not necessarily because there's more deception now than ever, it's always possible, but because we as humans depend on communication. It is what makes us human. And so when too much deception is there, it can become a real problem. But I think it's always important to step back a little bit from our current day-to-day and our sort of presentism bias, where we think the way it is now is the way it's always going to be. And remember, historically, we've always had these concerns about deception and trust. Now, my own professional interaction with deception was as a customs officer. So here I am, just off of Washington State. Actually, this is Bedwell Harbor. on Pender Island. So I had cleared through many boats from Washington. I also worked in Victoria. And you might be looking at the bulge there on my belt and think that's a gun, but no, very Canadian style. That was my stamp to welcome you into Canada. We're much nicer and more polite there for sure. But even in the 90s, when I was a customs officer, concerns about technology and deception were already present. You can see behind me this telephone. British Columbia, as Washington, has a very large marine coastline. And so there's many places where people can land. And instead of trying to guard all of it and putting custom officers like myself everywhere, we would put places where you could land with your boat and then call in to me and say, hey, I'd like to clear in here. There was a lot of concern that I wouldn't be able to look at the person. I couldn't look in their eyes or get a sense whether they seemed nervous, and that deception would rise. But in fact, what we find is that these kinds of telephone clearances weren't any more deceptive than the ones that we did face-to-face. And one reason that that's going to be important is because of the sort of folk theories we have about technology, and also about how we lie. Now, speaking of lying, we should probably start with a definition. Always good to have a crisp definition of what we're going to be talking about. So we're talking about deception a lot tonight. It has two key components. It's an intentional attempt to mislead someone. Mislead means that I'm going to try and create a false belief in somebody else. I'm going to get them to believe something that I know not to be true. It has to be intentional. I have to mean to do this. It can't be a mistake. So for instance, if Doug told me that the talk started at 7 instead of 6 and I showed up at 6, that's a mistake. But if you tried to actually create a false belief in me and did it on purpose, then that's a deception because it's intentional. So as we talk about deception throughout today, that's a really important thing for you to hold on, those two bits. Now, I thought I'd start off with a little bit of a description of some of the ways we've seen in my research group at the Stanford Social Media Lab, the ways that technology can shape how we lie. And I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of technology lies. The first is butlers, then we'll talk about sock puppets, and finally the Chinese 50-cent army. All very interesting kinds of lying phenomena. The first is butler lies. Now, if you've ever received this text message from somebody, on my way, then you've already been lied to and you've experienced a butler lie. On my way is deceptive almost 80 to 85% of the time. Usually what it means is I haven't left yet, I'm going to be a little bit late. So on my way is one of these classics. And weirdly, it was one of the few messages that was included in the iPhone when it first shipped. So on my way is an example. Sorry, my phone was dead, as a reason why I didn't get back to you right away or didn't answer. Or got work, got to go, why I have to leave a conversation now. Now, all of those are really common butler lies. Now, why did we call them butler lies? These were the lies that we saw in text messaging, and they were about coordinating our communication. And at first we thought, wow, text messaging is totally increasing how often people lie. This is a very common form of lying in text messaging. But then what we realized was that this was people dealing with a new problem. And that problem is that if Doug, for example, had my phone numbers, my digits, he could nowadays get a hold of me pretty much anytime, anywhere, 24/7. And I like Doug. Doug and I have talked on the phone at length, but there may be times when I don't want to talk to Doug, even though I like him and I still respect our relationship. So deception, these little butler lies, are like a solution to that new problem that technology, which is connecting us at all times, has created. And when we looked at a lot of these kinds of lies and we interviewed people about why they did them, it became clear that for many of these, it was about, well, I like this person. I don't want to harm our relationship, but if I tell them the truth, it might make them feel bad. And so they were navigating this new technological world. So it's an example of how sometimes these lies are solutions to new problems that technologies have brought up. It's not the case that butler lies are always good. We certainly saw examples of some where people were continually ghosting or ignoring other people, and those can be really hurtful. But it was a sense of how, yes, technology can increase these lies, but sometimes It's to try and help with a social situation. Next up is the sock puppet. I'm going to give you an example of a sock puppet lie. So here's an author, a British author named R.J. Ellery. He wrote a book called A Quiet Vendetta. The reviews were quite positive. Here's one reviewer, Nicodemus Jones, saying really positive things about A Quiet Vendetta. I think one of my favorites here is whatever else it might do, it will touch your soul. If you want to leave some reviews about this talk, go ahead and use that line. I think that's pretty good. And since we're here in a deception talk, you probably are guessing that Nicodemus Jones was actually R.J. Ellery. And he was busted for writing a lot of reviews positively about himself and his work and derogating other authors. This, of course, is not new. Walt Whitman was well known for doing these kinds of things, where he would write letters to the editor of newspapers across the country when one of his pieces came out. And that was definitely before the internet and social media. But what's changed with sock puppetry is how easy it is to do, and also how we can scale it up. And that's when we get to the Chinese, 50-cent Chinese army. Here in the US, it's also called astroturfing. This is where you get a lot of people to lie for you, essentially, for a small amount of money or some token. So in China, it's called the 50-cent army because my colleague, Jen Pan, discovered that a lot of Chinese government employees were told to lie about things around the government, mostly by being overly positive about things to do with the Chinese government or policy. In the US, astroturfing is when you pay people to make it seem like you really love a candidate. We're seeing a lot of that now with the US election. So it's paying people small amounts of money to say, yes, I love this candidate or I love that candidate. And it's deception because it appears like there's a lot more support for, say, a candidate or an idea. And we can see this, the example of fake reviews that I mentioned. One of the big problems that Amazon is cracking down on is how these fake reviews can be purchased. And so one of the things Amazon works really hard on is identifying companies that buy fake reviews. And there are markets to do that. It's always an arms race. With many things to do with deception, it's an arms race where there's a new opportunity for a kind of deception that will gain money or influence or power. And then there are forces that work against that deception. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, when there's too much deception, human communication breaks down. And so we work really hard on making sure we try to stay as honest as we can. All right, here's an example in China where there's whole factories that are dedicated to producing social media content and other propaganda, where you can pay folks very small amounts of money to say pretty much anything you want. And the large platforms, I mentioned Amazon already, but Google and Facebook and Netflix, they are working constantly to have to try and identify these operations and shut them down. And it's with mixed success, not no success, that's for sure, but not perfect. They're always trying to come up with new ways to do this. But the good news is that a substantial amount of the government, of academia, and of private industry is working hard to stop these kinds of operations. Okay, now what I want to switch over to is the opposite. So the studies I just showed you were ways in which our lab has found that technology can make deception more common, more easily conducted. Instead, on the other side, I want to show you some other studies that find something quite different, where technology in some contexts actually makes us lie less. So we've done a number of studies where we examine how often people lie in their day-to-day conversation. We do this a number of ways, but one way is a diary study. So we get them to track every conversation they have. And after that conversation, they say, well, it was face-to-face, or it was on the phone, or it was an email. And then they say whether they lied or not. And this is difficult to do, but participants are always really great and work really hard for us. And what we can then do is track how often did lies occur within a different medium. And we can look at, say, how often did conversations face-to-face involve a lie compared to phone. And what we found here was really interesting, and we've seen this replicated a number of times, is that the phone led to a lot of deception, more than email. And that suggested to us that it's not just technology that matters, but the kinds of technology, one, and then also who you're talking to. The first thing is the phone and email, while both technology, are actually really quite different. And one of the things that you're probably immediately thinking is like, oh yeah, on the phone it's voice, maybe that's what leads to it. But really the big difference is recordability. Most phone calls aren't recorded, although some are, and for most states, if they are, you have to be alerted to that. But email is highly recorded. Maybe it's one of the most recorded media we've ever created. My lawyer friends call email evidence mail. And indeed, in divorce cases in most states, a large percentage of cases use email and other digital messages like text messaging as primary sources of evidence. I have a copy of an email I sent, you have a copy of that email I sent you, and a number of other services have that email as well. So lying in email, as many politicians have found out, is very difficult and very tricky. We'll also come back to the fact that in email, there's a couple different kinds of contacts. When I'm interacting with my friends and family and coworkers, that's very different than interacting with people I've never met before. And what we'll see is that really matters. Email tends to be people that we know. And as we'll see, that's going to be a big difference when we get into social media. Another study, not done by my group, but a group down in Austin, got at this question of whether being on social media is deceptive or not in a totally different way. They weren't looking at deception. They were asking, can we tell somebody's personality if we meet them only on Facebook? And all we get to do is look at their profile. Really cool question. And at first blush, you think, there's no way. Like if I meet somebody face to face and I get to talk to them for a few minutes, I'll get to know them really well compared to if I just look at somebody's Facebook profile. They do this lovely set of experiments, very carefully done. And what they find is that that's not true. That people that met, say, Doug face to face, or if they only saw Doug's Facebook profile, they would do just as well at determining how extroverted he is and how conscientious and whether he was a neurotic kind of person or not, if they looked at the Facebook profile as if they met them in person. And the conclusion here is that even though we think of social media profiles and everything people do in social media as sort of like overly optimized and always the most beautiful things and not real life, it's actually, I think that's incorrect. Yes, we do present our best selves, but even here face to face, well, we're not together in a crowd, and unfortunately, well, hopefully one day we will be. I've put on like a nice jacket and a thing here because I want to look good in front of you all. And we do this all the time. Whenever we go out, this is really important to sort of appear positively. I'm not going to tell you about like the horrible things that happened to me this week. I'll tell you about, the good things, because we've just met and that's what we try to do. We try to put across a good self-presentation. One place where this is super obvious is in online dating. And a colleague of mine said, you know what you should do, Jeff? Look at online dating profiles and then compare what people said about themselves and measure people when they come into the lab. And you can kind of compare, like they said they were 5'11", but then when you measure them, how tall are they actually? And so this was a really cool way of getting this idea of like, how do people optimize and how do they use deception online? And allowed us to get at some ground truth, like what they actually look like. So here is a little bit of data. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so everybody can see it. And on the vertical axis there, the y-axis, is how tall they were when we measured them in the lab. And this is for men. And on the bottom there, on the horizontal axis, that's the profile height they said in their profile. Okay, so you've got how tall they said they were and how tall they actually were when we measured them. And that 45-degree line there, that slant, that is the truth line, if you will. And you can see most of the men are a little bit below that. In fact, they were about 9/10 of an inch below that on average. And what we say in the lab is that that's strong rounding up. If you're 5'7" and 1/10 of an inch, boom, 5'8". So men consistently said that they were taller than they actually were. So we could say, well, the technology made them do it. No, actually, that's not true. If you go and look at a men's shoe store and you measure the heels on most men's shoes, it's about 9/10 of an inch. So even when we're walking around in the face-to-face world, men try to come across as taller. Now, are they doing that because they're crazy? No. It turns out that both men and women find taller men, on average, more attractive. One example would be in American presidential politics. The taller candidate has won the popular vote about 90% of the time, just based on height. So if you know that people find taller men attractive, then the men were using either their shoes or the online dating profile to deceptively appear a little taller. Now, important thing to note here is the men weren't saying like, oh yeah, no, I'm 5 inches taller than I am. And if you think about it for a little bit, it starts to become apparent why. If you go and have coffee with that person who thought you were 5 inches taller than you were, then you're immediately considered a liar. And although you might have gotten to coffee, you're not getting anywhere else. So here we can see the strategic nature of it, using deception to appear more attractive, but not so much so that you are considered or viewed as a liar. Now, those of women in the crowd, you're probably nodding along and being like, yeah, men, geez, they lie about that kind of stuff. Let's take a look at women and how they talked about their weight. Now, this is a little unfair, and thanks in part to our study, online dating sites no longer ask women to specify what their weight is. But when we did this, they still did. And what we can see here is something really similar. On the y-axis, the vertical one is what their weight was when we put them on the scale when they came to the lab. And on the flat one, the horizontal, that's how tall they said they actually were. And the women, like the men, all said they were a little bit lighter than they actually were. And as they start to weigh more, they say they weigh more and more less than what they actually do. Okay, so again, we can ask the question, do men or are women lying because the technology is making them do it? No, once again, we see that women recognize that the men out there are more attractive to thinner women. And it's partly to do with the way our society values beauty, and it goes back several hundred years. And so they're just trying to use the technology to appropriate that. But once again, we see not massive lies. They were within 5% of their weight most of the time, and they were just trying to come across as attractive as possible without lying. And so for those of you that have done online dating, that's probably most of your experience, although everybody has that story of that one person that just was like, wow, totally different. All right, the key here, and my conclusion after looking at many, many studies about deception technology, when we know or we hope to meet the person, is that psychology beats technology almost every time. That is, just because we can lie doesn't mean we will. Instead, why we might lie, what we're trying to accomplish in the world is much more important. And we're going to see this theme of psychology beating technology throughout the rest of the talk. And I think it's probably one of the most important themes to take away, whether it's trying to think about how deception in general works, or is this email, which seems too good to be true, is it deceptive? It is a scam. The answer in that case, usually if it's coming from somebody you don't know, yes, it is. All right, so psychology beats technology. Now, these are a set of studies that we've been doing and are in the literature that show that in some instances, technology can reduce how we lie to one another. But there is definitely this sense in the US of a trust crisis, regardless of what those studies show. I'll reduce the slides down here so that everybody can see everything else on the screen. I think I have to do this. There we go. So this summer, Harvard Business Review had a whole issue on the trust crisis. And the concern here is pretty serious. There's a lot of national polls going back to the 90s showing trust, especially in the US, on the decline, particularly in institutions like the government, the church, and the media. But also some reported trust in people on the way down. And I think this is a real problem. But it's one that we need to think carefully about. Is it just that we can't trust anybody at all anymore? And the answer there, as you probably can tell, is no, I don't believe that. Instead, what it's important to think about is, who are we talking about? So in a lot of the work that I just showed you, we were analyzing how people trusted and told lies with people that they knew. These are friends, family, business colleagues, maybe even people you hope to know, like that online data that you're hoping to know, or a possible sales deal, right? A company that you're hoping to sell to, hoping to have a relationship. We have a reputational tie with this other person. Those kinds of people are what we refer to as the known network. And those people we have these reputations with. And when we're talking to people we don't really know and never will know, we can call those people the unknown network. These are strangers. These are maybe people that want something from us, but we don't know. This could be a Russian agent trying to convince us about some topic that they think is divisive. And in the face-to-face world, we're all actually really good at distinguishing known from unknown networks. If Doug approached and I was in the face-to-face world with him, I would immediately turn and wave and say hello and greet him. If somebody I didn't know came up and tried to talk to Doug and I, we would immediately turn away, make a decision together whether we'd want to actually look at him or not. We make very fast decisions about known and unknown network, or foe versus friend. And we're really good at keeping our distance and our guard up when it's an unknown person coming into our environment versus a known. Unfortunately, when we go into the online world, whether that's an email inbox or a Facebook news feed, these two networks collide. And in fact, they just sit on top of one another. So in my email inbox, I will have information and messages from Doug. And I'll have messages from a Nigerian prince who wants to give me a lot of money to get some of his money out. And maybe from an advertiser that I don't know at all. When those known and unknown networks sit on top of each other, it's much more difficult to determine who's being deceptive or not. And another unfortunate problem is that in our known network, friends, family, colleagues, people I want to know, I have a reputational tie with, deception tends to be quite low. We don't lie to each other very often. Most people are not lying most of the time. There's a few people we call prolific liars that lie much more than everybody else, but most people prefer not to lie, and they only use it as a last resort. In the unknown network, unfortunately, because they don't have reputational ties with us, deception is indeed rife. There are less constraints for those people. It's easy to send out billions of emails. It's easy to create lots of profiles to try and get you to buy something or believe something. So when those two networks collide and overlap in our online inboxes and feeds, that becomes really difficult to figure out where deception is taking place. And unfortunately, the unknown network deceivers can undermine our trust in our known network, which hasn't changed, in my view, in the way we lie to each other. But this unknown network has expanded greatly. The reason that Facebook, for example, is a multi-hundred-billion-dollar company is because people can get access to my attention, advertisers. They pay to get access to my feed and putting messages in there. And that's all fine and good. We've had advertising for a long time in magazines and newspapers and TV. But unfortunately, the same mechanism also allows deceptive agents, like Russian agents, to infiltrate our newsfeed and get access to my attention. Whereas a Russian agent 20, 30 years ago would have had to pay enormous amounts of money to fly over here, get into my network, and then introduce themselves to me. Now it's cents, dollars. So that's one of the major problems. But I think it's important for us to separate that unknown network that is rife with deception. And my colleagues at the Stanford Internet Observatory, for example, are documenting these kinds of operations all the time, and they're getting increasingly sophisticated, from my wife, my friends, my family, my business colleagues, who are not changing their lying behavior and are not likely to lie to me more than others. I think we often conflate those two. And as we talk about all the deception, we don't think about the fact that our family and friends and colleagues and maybe even our politicians aren't necessarily lying as much. Now, I want to go over a few more graphs. I promise this won't be too painful. But it takes a couple of years for us to get good science. And over the last 2 years, we've had pretty good data come out of the 2016 election when fake news sort of exploded as an important problem. And it's been great, actually, for our society to talk about fake news and what misinformation is. It's a way for us to think about how we can't believe everything that we read. We need to go back to literacy things like sources and checking out who has said what. But it's also a reminder that the way that fake news worked in 2016 wasn't that we all were seeing fake news. Here's a statistic up at the top. Only 1% of individuals accounted for 80% of fake news source exposure. So what that means is that only 1% of the population saw most of the fake news. And 0.1% accounted for almost all of the sharing of that fake news. So that means that it wasn't like everybody was targeted with fake news. In fact, when I would ask my class of undergraduates here at Stanford, how many of them had seen any fake news in their feed, none did. The only people in my class that recalled seeing any fake news in their feeds were some distinguished visitors in the class, people that were over 50. Well, it turns out that they were targeted. People that were over the age of 50, and in particular, people that are conservative, tended to get targeted more often with fake news. So I'm going to highlight a couple things here. You can see on the graph on the right that if you were over 65 in 2016, you were much, much more likely, 6 or 7 times more likely, of having some fake news occur in your online feed on Facebook than any of my students in my class. 6 or 7 times more likely. Right? Now, the other thing that was bad was that conservatives were also targeted. And they were targeted at much higher rates than people that were mainstream or liberal. Now, does this mean that the older people or that conservatives are bad or that they're more susceptible? 100% not. Absolutely not. Instead, in the example, for example, of older people, these people were being targeted because of the assets they have. They have more civic engagement. Older people over the age of 65 are more likely to vote. They're more likely to volunteer. They're more likely to be engaged in their community. They have also more assets than almost any other generation, more wealth built up. So if you want to target a demographic, then older people are a kind of target. And I've put in the resources on the site here a paper that my graduate student Ryan Moore led about older adults, social technologies in the pandemic. If you're interested in this sort of issue, I think it's a really good paper. It is academic, but I think Ryan did a great job on spelling out not only why older people were targeted, but also a lot of the opportunities that older folks have for combating disinformation. And I think it's really important to think about how older adults are actually becoming more resilient. Some recent new data show that younger people are also being targeted in different ways now, and that older people are becoming more resilient, which is some great news. I also share with you some information about a course at the end of the talk today. If you're interested in becoming more resilient to misinformation and getting some new skills on figuring out what's fact or fiction. Okay, so it's not like fake news is targeted at everybody equally. Now with the pandemic, we see that people that are over the age of 50 and 60 being targeted with pandemic information, COVID information. And this is a huge problem because we're seeing, instead of this conversation that's taking place in society of, hey, fake news is this real problem, but rather there are some parts of our population that need certain kinds of help. And if we can get more targeted, so older folks need some help around understanding some digital literacy or thinking about the ways of doing lateral browsing, for example, whereas young people need help on understanding, how do I judge whether this kind of a myth is real or not? We can start rethinking how fake news works. We can start thinking about known and unknown networks, and we can start targeting are helped to specific demographics. Okay, I want to switch now to a big question a lot of people have around how do you detect deception? And rather than diving into how to do that online, I'm going to give us a little bit of a primer on how to do that face-to-face. So the first thing to know is there's only one effect in deception detection research. We've been studying this for 60, 70 years, and that's something called the truth bias. We tend to believe what other people say. And it's actually very heartwarming. We actually believe other people. And people that believe other people live good lives. They're not skeptical, etc. all the time. And so there's this real powerful truth bias, because most of the time we are being told the truth. The other thing that's amazing that people have a hard time believing is there is no Pinocchio's nose. There is no actual cue to deception that will always tell you if somebody's lying. And most of the time when I talk to older adults, they all know this. They don't try to rely on shortcuts and figure out, okay, is there a way to tell somebody's lying or not? But a lot of people still struggle with this observation. There is no Pinocchio's nose. And that also means that online there's no Pinocchio's nose either. So we have a truth bias. There is no reliable cue. Over hundreds of studies, thousands of participants, when you're just presented with a truth or a lie, we tend to do really poorly, about 54% accuracy. So we're not really good on one-off things. Is this a lie or a truth? We're not very good at it. And last, important to remember, people lie for a reason. Those scams are not there because they're doing it for fun. They want money. Or that Russian agent isn't trying to convince you about BLM being good or bad. They're trying to provoke you. So when we think about all of these things, we can also start to look at the future of lying by looking way, way back in our history. So we've been talking for at least 50,000 years, probably longer. And over that course of time, there's been at least 100 billion humans that have evolved language for us, evolved the way we speak to one another now. The amazing thing there is that we didn't start writing until 3200 BC. So that means most of the humans that evolved language for us, they never recorded a thing. They evolved not only communication, but also lying to take place in an environment in which there was no record. And it's not even until very, very recently that the printing press took place, 500 years, and now we're in the networked age. If I were to ask all of you, how many of you have actually written any text today, almost all of you would say you have, right? So we've gone from like no record of our communication to massive amounts. And this has huge implications because for most of human existence, when somebody lied, it disappeared. Now, when somebody writes one of these fake reviews, in fact, there is a record. So here is a test for you. I'll get you to do this quietly on your own. One of these is a review about the James Hotel. It's a real review from hotels.com. And the other one is a fake review that my research team purchased. Your job now is to try to choose whether A is fake or B is fake. And I'll give you 20 seconds to sort of skim through it. All right, now I'm not going to give you too much time because all of you have done this. This is about looking at reviews really quickly, right, as you try to decide where you're going to stay. Some of you would get it right, and that was B. Right? And some of you have good ideas that it was like overly positive. That would be right. Some of you have other ideas like it's spelling. That wouldn't be right. But what would happen if we did this poll officially is there'd be a few more B people and quite a few A, and we'd perform around 54%. Turns out it's really hard to tell if something's deceptive just by looking at it. And so a lot of colleagues in communication now and people that study deception are talking instead about deception, talking about cues around believability. Now, here's a peacock, and some of you probably know why a peacock does this. It's very costly to have all these beautiful feathers, but it's not signaling anything around deception. I think it's signaling credibility. It's saying basically like, hey, I've got such good genes that I can make all these fantastic feathers and fight off predators and eat lots. You should mate with me, right? And this is not just for animals. This is also human. We do this too. Here are two human heads, And if I were to get you to say, which one would you trust more? Which one do you think is more trustworthy, A or B? Everybody would pick B. There'd be a few people that say A, but that's just, they're having fun. Most people would pick B. It's got round cheeks, rounder eyes, gentler slope to the forehead, and a little smile. And we would have that very strong sense of believability, even though these are made up humans, right? They don't even exist. But we would all agree that B has these believability cues. And this is a really deep new way of thinking about deception. And for those of you interested in really learning about the new science of deception detection, I highly recommend this book, Duped, by my colleague Timothy Levine. It's fantastic. And he tells us we don't try to detect deception. We just decide whether we believe, we think somebody is believable or not. And those are different from deception. When we take those same kind of principles and think about things online, it gets us to think about, well, who's talking to us? Is it somebody I know? Is it a source like, say, the Seattle Chronicle? Like, can I believe them? And so Duped moves us away from trying to decide if are their lies looking, are their eyes funny or not, to thinking about what do we know about whether or not this person or entity is trustworthy. And I think this is a great new way. And if you don't want to read this book, it's a bit thick. Malcolm Gladwell's new book is very much based on Duped. So if you like his writing, he does a good take on this as well. And last, if you're really interested in how do we protect ourselves, what are some techniques for sorting fact from fiction? This is the course I was mentioning earlier. It's by Pointers. MediaWise is a great group of people trying to educate folks so that they are less likely to be duped by fake news or misinformation. And it's an online course. It's free. And I can tell you right now that I've been really impressed by people that have taken the course and how well they do it, sort of being able to determine fact from fiction. So I strongly encourage you to check out this course. It's highly worth it. Perfect timing with the election coming up and all of the disinformation coming out there. So I want to conclude by just saying a big thank you for your attention in the evening here. I think already the fact that you're here is really great and means that we're all about to become better at sorting fact from fiction. And I hope we can save time for some questions because I know that people have a lot. Thank you once again, and just a big thank you to my colleagues at the Stanford Social Media Lab, Sunny Liu, who helps direct it, and Ryan Moore, who's been doing a lot of work on older folks and their ability to use technology and deception. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff. That was a fascinating talk. And everybody hung in there. Just about everybody who logged on at the beginning is still there. So obviously we have held people's attention. Good job. I've been writing down questions that have been coming in. And the dilemma is every question I get is, that's the best question I'm going to ask. What is the role of repetition in, we see this with political figures, not to name names or anything, where you keep repeating the same thing over and over again. Is that a common tool by people who lie?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there, Doug, but yes, it's a powerful tool, unfortunately. It's a powerful weapon in deception. We come to believe things that we hear repeatedly. The bad news is that's the case. So cognitively, we're kind of built that way. The good news is journalists have figured out this problem. And where politicians in the past have been able to force journalists to repeat the claim and then negate it or rebut it, journalists are developing new practices where the claim itself is no longer part of the headline. And in the same way that I know it's easy to worry about these new techniques, I always believe in humans. We can adapt. When we see these techniques, it might take us a little while to cotton on to it, but I believe journalists are now starting to figure out how to deal with that better.
I have an interesting question here about how do you correlate impression management and lying? Because a lot of what you've been talking about are people on Facebook and the impression they're trying to leave. Is there any way to address that? Just if I just want to look good, but I'm not telling the truth about myself. I guess that was your point with the graphs of people reporting their weight and their height slightly. I thought that was interesting that they don't do it a lot, but they do it slightly in the off chance they might actually meet the person.
Yeah, right, exactly. No, I mean, this is literally is what my students in my introduction to comm class were talking about over the last 2 weeks is when is it a lie? When does that become a lie? And everybody believes there's a moment where you cross a line. But that most of us, we have to engage in this. We always are trying to put our best foot forward. And I think that social media gets a really bad rap because it has all these opportunities to use filters or select that one photo. And we see a lot of positive stuff online, but that we do this face to face too. This is a human thing, not a technology thing. And so I think it's a fair question and there's no one answer, but we all can get a sense of when that line is crossed.
There was a question here about your diary study, and I actually asked you this offline a week ago when we were talking about people are self-reporting when they lie. How can you tell that they're being truthful? You must have somehow controlled for that.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's sort of the meta line, like how can we trust people to be honest about their line? And reviewer two always. We were looking at, say, how Jeff lies face to face, to how Jeff lies on the phone, to how Jeff lies in email, etc. And so what we do is we would say, well, Jeff probably has some bias and he's underreporting lying at some level, but we're comparing Jeff to Jeff to Jeff. And so that's how we dealt with that. I'll also say most participants, we've done other things where we can check whether they're lying to us about other kinds of things, like in the online dating study. And what we found is that people tend to be pretty honest to researchers. And so it's not perfect, but we felt like we had a pretty good handle on it.
The thing I was asking you about before, and I'll just take license here and ask my own question again for the folks, this whole deception consensus effect thing, where you want to talk a little bit about that, what that is and what the significance is of it.
Yeah, so Doug and I have talked about this a lot, and really it comes down to this. If you lie a lot, then you also believe that other people lie a lot. And if you tell the truth most of the time, like I said earlier, most people do, then you believe other people are telling the truth most of the time. So this is called the deception consensus effect, but it also comes with a punishment, right? So if you lie a lot, then you're worried about other people lying to you. So for people that are lying a lot, you'll see when they attack their opponents, they'll often accuse them of lying as well. And so you can see that they have to go through that. Now, those people that are likely to be scammed more often, it's true, they tend to have the sort of like strong truth bias. But I think the truth bias has tremendous value because most of the time we are being told the truth. And one of the values of living in a place like the United States or Canada, where I'm from, is that we have, typically really non-corrupt governments. Yes, there's issues 100%, but we mostly can trust in those kinds of contexts. And that's one of the huge benefits of having a trusting society, and that we have to work hard to make sure we don't lose.
You had mentioned that conservatives and older folks are more targeted by fake news. And you may have mentioned this, and I may have just forgotten it, so I apologize. But what's the explanation for that? You mentioned that they were, older people have more money and so forth, but a lot of this is in a political context. Do you have a theory about that?
Yeah, I think older people are more likely to head to the ballot box. They're more likely to get out there and volunteer and knock on doors. And they also have time resources, right? So a lot of times older adults have more discretionary time. So those are the reasons that are being targeted, along with having more wealth. The cool thing, as my student Ryan Moore has pointed out in the paper that I recommended, is those are the same advantages that older adults have in combating this. So older adults tend to be really good at judging character, for example. They tend to have more discretionary time, so they can do the kinds of source analysis or doing lateral browsing where you look across sources. They can dedicate some of their time to understanding things that they think are important. They also take on more shepherd type roles. They're worried about their family and their friends. And so when they see problematic news, they're more likely to share it. But now I think what we're seeing with seniors that have been receiving training, et cetera, about how technologies work and disinformation works, they're also doing some of that work on shutting down the sharing of these kind of fake news. So again, I'm really optimistic that although older adults might be targeted more in some ways, they also have the resources available to become really great fact checkers.
Interesting. Thank you. What about intentionally withholding information? Is that a type of lying?
It is.
Lying
it's a
by
lie of omission.
Yeah.
That's right. That's one of the oldest ones. Aristotle talked about this. Aquinas, all the people that have come up with the taxonomies of lies. It's the hardest lie. And for us to look at, very difficult because you're not saying something. And so, clever lies, good liars, lies of omission are sort of the best way to go. And in court and things like that, it's the only way to lie without being perjured. So yeah, it's an important form of lying and really difficult to analyze and to detect.
So getting close to the end here, Jeff, but someone asked, there are several sources that rate factuality. What sources do you use to determine potential bias of a source?
Right. So this is important. And I would share with you what sources I read. But the problem there, if you do it like that, is I could say, well, I love the Washington Post and things I see there, I trust. But if you're somebody that's strongly conservative, you might be like, no way, that is exactly who I wouldn't trust. So what I argue, and there's a lot of great organizations like NewsGuard, the MediaWise course goes over these things too, is you need to figure out whether the story is coming from an organization that practices professional journalistic practices. Right? So there are, fly-by-wire groups and individuals that are just trying to make money or are being paid to say certain things. And then there are organizations that follow professional journalistic practices. Identify 1 to 2 to 3 of these organizations that you trust, that you feel resonates with your political take, and believe in that. So if you're a huge fan of Fox News, and here again, I'm talking about the news portions of Fox News, or you're a fan of, say, NBC, and again, I'm talking about the news portions of NBC, then you should trust those entities. Although they're viewed sometimes as more liberal or more conservative, they follow professional journalistic practices, and they hold themselves accountable when they make mistakes, which they do. And that's different from the thousands of other small little organizations that are trying to convince you of X, Y, or Z. So I personally rely on my news by getting the app or the website of the organizations that I trust, and I get my news from those apps or organizations and not through social media.
Excellent. That's great. Well, that's all the time we have today, Jeff. I just want to thank you again for taking time out to give us this great talk. I learn something new every time I hear you talk, and I've watched a lot of the stuff you have online. So you just did an excellent job today. And I want to just on behalf of our sponsors, AARP Washington, the Center for an Informed Public, BECU, thank all of you for attending. All of you seem to hang in there most of the time, so obviously this topic resonates. And if you haven't already done so, consider registering for our 4th and final event, which happens on October 24th, featuring Jevin West, who is the director of the Center for an Informed Public, and David Mickelson, who is the founder of Snopes, the well-known fact-checking organization that's based right here in Tacoma, Washington. And the two of them and myself will serve on a panel which will talk about sort of the science of fact-checking, the mechanics of it. Who can you really believe? Can you trust the fact checkers? All of that kind of stuff. It's a fascinating topic, and we can't wait to get more of it. Thanks again to our sponsors and to Jeff Hancock, and thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.